What's up guys, welcome to the Chess Giant. This is Solomon Ardell, and recently we made a video on the theory behind the Hippopotamus Defense, an opening that you can play with as either the white pieces or the black pieces. But today's video, we're not just going to be covering the principles and the lines and strategy behind the opening, but really see this setup come to life in a grandmaster versus grandmaster game. Many people, when they see the Hippopotamus opening, think that it's a very slow and defensive opening, and honestly, at first sight, I totally understand this assumption. The whole setup involves fianchettoing both of our bishops on g7 and b7, and then playing e6, d6, tucking our knights behind, oftentimes playing moves like h6 and a6. And the reason we do this is to really take control of this fifth rank. And from there, if white has pawns on e4 and d4, we have potential f5 and c5 ideas, trying to break the game open. One of my favorite features of the Hippopotamus Defense against a e4 and d4 setup is that following f5 and c5, no matter what white does, one of our bishops, if not both, are going to become very aggressive attacking pieces once the game opens up. But I've shown you probably about 40 arrows and no moves. So let's hop into the game. With white, we have John Ems. Many of you have probably heard of him. He's written almost 30 high-quality chess books. And with black, we have none other than the Ginger GM, Simon Williams, amazing chess.com teacher. Honestly, he's probably my favorite. Here he used the Hippopotamus Defense and played it in amazing fashion. The game started off with Ems playing e4, and now we see the modern defense with g6, followed by bishop g7, immediately putting pressure on that d4 pawn. And following knight f3, we now see d6 followed by a6. Really, the move order at the Hippopotamus Defense doesn't matter a ton, but usually what you're going to see is the modern defense with g6, bishop g7, d6, and then a6. And honestly, there's not a ton white can do to stop this. We now see Ems continue with bishop e3, and we now play knight d7, followed by e6, and now following the move bishop d3, we see h6, really trying to protect that g5 square from the knight, the bishop, and the queen on d2. And following castling kingside, we now see b6, and now white does an interesting maneuver with knight e2, followed by knight g3, bringing the knight to c3 all the way to g3, really trying to make this an attacking piece on the king side of the board. We now see knight e7 from the Ginger GM, and now after h3, black has officially set up the Hippopotamus Defense, putting pawns on h6, g6, e6 and d6, and lastly the pair on b6 and a6. And in addition to this, has a very interestingly strong bishop pair attacking e4 and d4, as well as knights on e7 and d7. But now we're not going to play passive moves like queen c8 or queen b8 or rook c8, just kind of moving around, waiting for white to attack us. We're going to play attacking chess as we see the Ginger GM play f5, trying to break through in this game right in the center of the board. This bishop and pawn are both putting pressure on e4, and white may have been tempted to take the pawn on f5, but I actually think Ems was pretty wise not to, because if white takes this pawn, first off, this bishop on b7 is now very active, attacking that knight on f3, and on top of that, we can now play knight takes f5, this knight very active, attacking the bishop on e3, as well as the pawn on d4, and if a move like knight takes f5, we can now just play g takes f5, followed by castling kingside. I like black's game here. We have a strong bishop on b7, attacking that knight, another strong bishop on g7, and a knight on d7 that can eventually play moves like knight f6, followed by either knight e4 or even knight d5, putting pressure on e3 and f4. On top of that, we have pawn f4 ideas. I love black's game here. So instead of taking the pawn on f5, we now see the move c4. And now we see Simon use a very common chess strategy in the Hippo Defense. On the queen side, if we play the move c5, which is a very common move, putting pressure on d4 with both our pawn and our bishop, we're then going to continue to mount the pressure with knight c6, attacking that pawn on d4. Well, the same goes with the king side of the board. We played f5, putting pressure on e4 with both our pawn and our bishop. Why not play the move knight f6, mounting even more? We now have a knight, a bishop, and a pawn all attacking e4, and even at the master and grandmaster level, I often see white fall into playing e takes f5 or e5, but I don't think either of these are very good options. Here, Ems played the very best move with d5, which is why he played c4, really trying to reinforce this pawn on d5, but we now see Simon in vintage GM Ginger fashion take the pawn on e4, take the pawn on d5. And again, guys, in the Hippopotamus Defense, it may start to look very passive and very slow, but the whole point of putting our bishops on g7 and b7 is to break the game open and have ourselves very aggressive and active pieces. We now see white continue with knight takes f6 check, and after bishop takes f6, c takes d5. Here, black continued with a move, queen d7, and now white played bishop e4. The whole point of bishop e4 is that both our bishop and our knight attack this pawn on d5. Queen d7 was played so that castling kingside would be possible. But now after bishop e4, we see castling queenside, and here white snatches a pawn with bishop takes h6, but this one pawn advantage only lasts one move, because we now see the Ginger GM take that pawn on b2. Whole idea being if queen takes b2, we simply take the bishop on h6. So here M's continued with rook a b1, now attacking the bishop with the rook. So we have to get that bishop out of the way with a move like bishop a3. And now following bishop e3, we see knight f5, a very active move, attacking that bishop on e3. And honestly here, I like the move knight g5 for white, attacking both e6 and f7. And on top of that, this knight on g5 wouldn't be attacked by a pawn for the rest of this game because we don't have any pawn on h7 or f7 that can get rid of it. But here white played knight d4, and honestly, I don't really know about this move. I think the knight on g5 would have been much better than on d4 when black can simply take it. I understand that this knight is active, but I think the knight on g5 would have been more active. Here Simon snatches that knight off the board, wasting no time. Simon doesn't want to allow knight e6 or knight c6, in which the game would practically be over. So here we see knight takes d4, and after queen takes d4, bishop c5 attacking that queen, and after the queen drops back, king b8. Why would a move like king b8 be played? Well, here white wants to take on g6, and the bishop could very easily swing right back to f5, pinning the queen to the king on c8. So here Simon was like, okay, I just got to get my king out of here. And now John M's playing with the white pieces, in my opinion, made a pretty big mistake. Up to this point, white has been playing pretty solid chess, but now white goes with the move bishop takes c5. And honestly, I just don't see the point of this move, because now we see d takes c5 with a protected pass pawn on c5, and now three pieces, the bishop, the queen, and the rook. A move prior, none of them were attacking the pawn, but now we have three pieces attacking the centralized d5 pawn, and here I think black is actually better. White plays the move queen g3, a very tricky and sneaky move. We may be tempted to play a move like rook g8, trying to defend the pawn on g6, but the whole point of queen g3 is to not attack the pawn on g6, but threaten rook takes b6, because our pawn can't take the rook simply because it's pinned to the king on b8. So here we see the move queen d6, erasing any thoughts of rook takes b6, attacking the queen on g3, and now we see the move queen takes g6, in which we trade into an endgame and take on d5. Here we have a very interesting position. White with three passed pawns on h3, g2, and f2 ready to be thrown down the board, and black right now with only two. But we're actually about to have two more passed pawns on b6 and a6. This bishop is attacking the pawn on a2, and it may seem like an obvious move to play something like a3, but this would actually be a catastrophic mistake for white, because we now have rook hg8 attacking the bishop on g6, and once the bishop runs away, we can now take that pawn on g2 with check, forcing the king on h1, take the pawn on f2, checking the king on h1 again, and after king g1, again, we're going to play rook g2 check. This king is in a box. It's trapped. We see king h1, king g1, back and forth and back and forth. If there were more pawns here, we would snatch each pawn and just keep going back to g2, keep coming back to g2. There's nothing left to eat on the second file right now. So following king h1, we now play rook d2 check, attacking the bishop. I mean, if a move like rook f3, we simply take the rook. And if a move like king g1, we can now swing our rook to g8, attacking the king. And after bishop g6, which is forced, we now have ourselves a checkmate. Game over. So here John M's was very smart not to play a move like a3 or rook b2, simply saving a mere pawn, because we would have rook g8 attacking the bishop, and more importantly, attacking the pawn on g2 once the bishop gets out of the way. So here we see Ems play f4, a strong move here, whole idea being if rook g8, now f5 could be played, saving the bishop, and more importantly, saving the very vulnerable pawn on g2. Here we see Simon take that pawn on a2, and here we have ourselves a race. One with white, the very well-known author with nearly 30 books, and black with the very well-known chess.com personality. White with 3 passed pawns, black with 4. Who can get their pawns to the other side first? Right now our bishop is attacking the rook, and following rook bc1, we now see bishop d5, really centralizing this bishop, putting pressure on that g2 pawn, and following f5, the race has began. We play c4, and now rook f4 is played. This move may seem a little weird, but the whole point is to really prepare this h4 push, protecting that pawn. We now see Simon, the Ginger GM, continue in regular GM Ginger Grandmaster type fashion with b5, protecting that pawn on c4, and after h4, playing a5. We see f6, a4, f7, a3. Usually in chess endgames, you don't want to just push your pawns down the board, but right now there is nothing stopping them. Passed pawns must be pushed. We see white continue with rook f6, and the whole idea here is that if a2, rook a6 could be played, winning that pawn on a2. So now we see king b7, really protecting that key a6 square, and after h5, we now continue with b4, and after rook f5, b3. The Ginger GM wasting 0 time getting his pawns down the board. And now John Ems had an interesting tactic with rook takes d5. And after rook takes d5, bishop e4, pinning the rook to the king. And for a second, it may seem as if black is in a little bit of trouble here. I mean, white is about to be ahead in material, but here Grandmaster Simon Williams did not even care about the rook on d5 by playing a move like c6, but simply played a2, leaving the rook to fall on d5. But now after bishop takes d5, we're able to play c6, attacking that bishop, and following bishop takes c4, we now see why Simon Williams really didn't care about his rook because of this b2 move, attacking the rook on c1. If the rook moves away, we simply have a move like a1 equals queen, and if bishop takes a2 is played, we take the rook, we make a queen, we have ourselves a 1 endgame. If you'd like to learn more about the theory behind the Hippo Defense, click the video to the left. If you'd like to learn more about chess openings in general, click the playlist to the right. Leave a comment to let me know what other videos you'd like to see covered on this channel, and as always, I appreciate you guys. Thanks for watching. Peace.